Aaron Hedlund is joining me now. He's Director of Research and Director of the Center for American Prosperity with the America First Policy Institute, AmericaFirstPolicy.com. He's also former senior advisor under Donald Trump's White House Council of Economic Advisors. Aaron is joining me now on the Scott Sand Show. Great to have you on.
Great to join you.
So the numbers that we're seeing under the last 4 years of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are rather bleak. Inflation averaging 5.2%, 3 times the average inflation rate under President Trump. We're seeing that average weekly earnings are down 3.25%. Real average weekly earnings were up 8.2% under President Trump. But put it in no BS terms for me, Aaron. How bad really is the economy? Is it what we're all feeling in our wallet and savings account today?
Absolutely. It's a real tragedy. I mean, we are in the midst of an affordability crisis. We're talking cumulative price increases of over 20% in just a few years. Incomes are down from where they were in 2019. Yet usually incomes go up. That's what we're used to as America, a growing economy, thriving incomes. And in fact, under President Trump's policies, you saw incomes jump by over $7,000 after inflation in just a couple-year period of time. You had historically low poverty rates. I mean, it's really a robust economy, and Americans want that to come back.
You know, a year and a half ago, obviously, the inflation, the economy was struggling, and there were all sorts of calls for Joe Biden's head, essentially, when he was still the candidate. And I think based on the economy a year and a half ago, Donald Trump would have won this election in a landslide. But there are so many polarizing issues today, and we are seeing prices start to come down somewhat. Gas prices have started to come down. It's weird how that's happening right before an election. We're starting to see consumer goods come down slightly. Weird right before an election. Even some consumer companies like Ruffles Lay's has announced that they're going to start putting more chips back into the bag. It's weird how that's happening right before an election, but I'm sure it's just a coincidence. Do you think the economy is still the top issue that voters are going to be thinking about when they go into the polls in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, I'd say those top issues for voters have got to be inflation, this affordability crisis, and of course the border as well. And I would say by and large, prices are actually not coming down. I mean, you got prices are going up more slowly than they were, and you might have the isolated thing that's getting cheaper. But really, again, that 20% price increase is baked in and shows no signs of going away. And I wouldn't.
I'm sorry, you're starting to cut out, Aaron.
I was going to say, I mean, prices are still high, and I would not expect prices to come down until there are some price changes, some policy changes.
I mean, we still need to buy all of these things. We need to put food on the table. We need to put gas in our cars, and the only way to pay for it with these higher prices is if our wages go up. But if our wages go up, doesn't that also drive up inflation?
Well, it doesn't have to. Right? If you have a pro-growth set of policies that increase productivity, then you can get more pay and more output without getting the higher prices. And that's what we saw under the previous policies. We saw incomes go up, but not prices. I mean, inflation was consistently below 2% per year under President Trump's policies.
And if the wages are going up, what does that do to the job market? Does that increase unemployment?
No. I mean, again, when you have strong productivity growth driven by pro-growth policies, you can get historically low inflation and historically low unemployment and historically low poverty rates, which is, again, what we saw. But think about the policy differences, right? In 2017, you had major tax reform that made us globally competitive again for the first time in a long time. We had massive deregulation, which meant that we were energy independent for the first time in 70 years. Contrast that with the past few years, policies have been all about government spending, stimulus, debt, and more regulation, and it's had the exact opposite effect.
Aaron Hedlund here on the Scott Sand Show, former chief economic advisor on the White House Council of Economic Advisors, and now director of research and director for the Center of American Prosperity, the America First Policy Institute. One of the things that I am concerned about, Aaron, is our national debt. Walk me through, in terms I can understand after being educated in Mississippi and Alabama, what happens under Donald Trump with $11 trillion in tax cuts versus Kamala Harris with $5 trillion in tax increases. What does that do to our national debt? Obviously, I want my taxes cut, but if you're going to cut taxes, you also, I believe, need to cut spending somewhere, and I don't see that under Donald Trump's plan.
Well, if we go back to the pre-pandemic period when President Trump was in office, you had debt as a share of the economy actually being stable. So it'd be great to have even more spending discipline coming from Congress, but you at least had debt as a fraction of the economy being stable, which is a sustainable kind of thing. What we've seen over the past few years is that debt as a share of the economy absolutely ballooned, and the trajectory is extremely horrible. I mean, we just found out that $1.8 trillion single year deficit this past year. I mean, it makes no sense. We're in peacetime. And that's the big difference. Is you've seen a permanent increase in spending happen post-COVID, where the left has really tried to transform the country and transform the relationship between citizens and the government. And what we saw before under President Trump was not that. You had a limited government. The American people were put first, and debt was stable.
Well, and you talk about spending discipline in Congress. That's why the congressional elections are also so important. We need to make sure that we elect some fiscally responsible members of Congress, which we have not had in decades. And somebody needs to eventually stand up and say, hey, guys, we need a budget here. We just can't keep passing 13 spending bills willy-nilly.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, spending is out of control, and there are too many politicians in D.C. who judge programs and policies by their intentions and not by the results. It's long past time to look at programs and say, is it accomplishing what it's supposed to be doing? And if it's not accomplishing what it's supposed to be doing, the solution isn't to just double and triple the budget, which is the typical impulse, but sometimes it's to say, you know what, maybe we don't need this program because it's not working.
Aaron Hedlund here on the Scott Sancho from the America First Policy Institute, AmericaFirstPolicy.com. Talk to me about tariffs, which is something that President Trump has brought back up recently on the campaign trail, how he wants to impose, or at least he's threatening to impose tariffs on foreign goods coming into the country. What does that do to the economy? Is that not an additional tax on what we as consumers wind up paying?
Well, first of all, we're definitely not talking about any kind of additional tax, right? I mean, you can use revenues from tariffs to lower other taxes, to lower corporate taxes, to lower income taxes, things that are very damaging to economic growth. And unfortunately, there's a lot of scaremongering that happens with discussions about tariffs, including the discussion of, will there be a trade war? Well, I think what more and more Americans realize is we've been in the middle of a trade war for many years now. We just haven't been fighting it. It's been China fighting against us, stealing intellectual property, not playing by the rules, really trying to change the global economic rules in its own favor. And the reality is, if you want them to change their behavior, you can't just ask them politely to do it. You have to have actually some leverage to pressure them to do it. And that's where tariffs can be very valuable.
Where do tariffs benefit Americans most? It was interesting. I watched over the weekend as the Steelworkers Union in Pennsylvania endorsed Donald Trump, and one of the members, and I'm going to get these numbers wrong, I'm sure, but one of the members was talking about how Pennsylvania at one point had 14 or 17 steel mills in the state. Now it's down to 4 that are still in business. Steel's obviously a commodity where tariffs have protected American jobs in the past.
Yeah, so I mean, the way I would view tariffs is, first of all, they're a great negotiating and leverage tool, and especially when you're talking about countries that are abusing the rules. And secondly, you want to be systematic about it, right? You don't want tariffs or really any policy to turn into, some groups pulling for just their industry and not other industries or whatever. You want to make sure you're taking a systematic approach to it. But that's exactly what we've seen happen, right? What we saw is that President Trump implemented tariffs to actually push back against China, and that brought them to the negotiating table. That they realized that they were not going to be able to push around America anymore, and that's that kind of strong negotiating position from people who actually know how businesses operate and how negotiations work. We need that kind of leadership back.
One thing that I think, Aaron, and correct me if I'm wrong and misinterpreting this, that I'm not hearing enough talk about as we're talking about the economy as we get ready for the election in a couple of weeks is credit card debt. Not only the 30-year fixed mortgage rate as people are trying to buy a house, but credit card delinquency rates, which are up 54% in the last 4 years under Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. That's weakening American families and putting us all in debt. And that's a direct effect of this Biden-Harris economy.
It's a total disaster. I mean, you can really trace all our economic weakness and troubles right now to the bad policies that have been implemented over the past few years, especially starting in 2020.